Imagine 1.3 billion Chinese with rapidly rising incomes coming into the U.S. grain market, competing with us for our grain supply, driving up our food prices. Like it or not, what happens to the glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau and in the Himalayas is going to affect all of us.
After a short visit to China, Lester Brown's travels took him to Japan, Korea, India, Turkey, and Italy. From world capital to world capital, over a span of 22 days. During a series of lectures and press conferences, he shared his ideas about the urgency of finding ways to halt global warming.
It is clear that Plan A, business as usual, is no longer a viable option. There's a real sense of urgency now developing on the climate front based on solid science. That will begin to move the economy in a carbon-free direction, which is where we need to go if we're going to stabilize the Earth's climate. I see my responsibility as trying to look ahead and see what's coming and then share that information with decision makers. Thank you very much.
The trip also gave him a chance to meet with political leaders. During private meetings and off-the-record conversations, he was often able to learn where government officials stood on sensitive environmental issues.
For example, when in India and meeting with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who is an economist and who's done a great job of getting the Indian economy into gear and to begin to raise people out of poverty. When I talked with him about the melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas and the effect it would have on India's future food security, he knew about that. I mean, I was not telling him something he didn't know. But what he couldn't quite figure out was what to do about it.
When in South Korea, he was invited to meet with the mayor of Seoul, Oh Se-hoon, who was having difficulty coping with the public's reaction to a series of environmental issues. For weeks, the city was paralyzed by massive demonstrations.
This is a very busy day. So much is happening. You can hear the demonstrators from here.
Yeah. Korea is very, very dynamic.
Maybe too dynamic sometimes.
Too dynamic, yeah.
Just outside of the mayor's office, thousands were demonstrating against two government environmental policies: the importing of aged beef and the construction of a major but unneeded canal. In the evening, the crowd swelled to over 500,000.
What I found interesting wasn't so much the nature of their complaints, but rather that a call to action by the environmental community could generate such a huge response. However, what really caught my attention was what happened one evening.
As the demonstrators continued their orderly protest, something provoked the crowd. Suddenly, a peaceful demonstration turned violent.
For me, it was, in a sense, a look at the future. What could happen when even more serious environmental challenges, like global food shortages due to climate change, go unanswered? During the course of my road trip, it became clear to me that we're now faced with challenges not only on a scale and of an urgency we've not seen before, but challenges with a complexity we could never have imagined.
Please take the shuttle bus leaving from bus terminal number 3.
During my tour of Asia and Europe, I often had the luxury of time. Time to think about the consequences of climate change and whether it could lead to food shortages on a global scale. However, the more that I thought about the future, the more my thoughts turned to the past. To past civilizations that suddenly collapsed. What I finally became convinced of was that most early civilizations that collapsed did so because of a severe decline in their food supply. It happened thousands of years ago, and it happened as recently as 500 years ago in sub-Saharan Africa.
In a remote part of Zimbabwe, there's a site containing the ancient ruins of what was once a thriving medieval city. The Shona tribe called it the Great Zimbabwe. Founded in the 12th century, its population grew to over 17,000 until it was abandoned in the early 1500s.
What really interested me was the story behind the city's collapse. That the Great Zimbabwe was deserted because depleted pastures and dwindling water supplies could not support its exploding population.
Certainly a number of past civilizations have failed because their food supply crashed. Often that was linked to a changing climate or an induced change in climate or just poor agricultural practice, which in the end sort of reduced the ability to produce food.
I think in the past when we've looked at failed states, we're looking at some series of unintended consequences combined with catastrophes that struck and sort of pushed one civilization or a state or over the edge.
I often ask myself, why didn't the leaders of ancient civilizations make those connections before their cultures collapsed? Weren't there early warning signals that could have helped them save their empires? And what about today? Surely there must be something we could learn from what happened to the Great Zimbabwe or other failed civilizations.
The more Lester Brown became convinced of the link between food and lost civilizations, the more he integrated the concept into his prepared remarks.
We look at the Sumerians and the buildup of salt in their soils as a result of a defect in the design of their irrigation system. As salt levels built up, grain yields came down. They switched to barley, which is more salt tolerant, and eventually barley yields went down, and with that, the civilization went down. We look at the Mayan civilization, the most advanced in the New World, and we see deforestation and soil erosion undermining their cropland productivity. As the soil eroded, yields began to decline. As yields declined, the civilization declined and eventually collapsed. And I asked myself, could this happen to us?
His message was quickly picked up by the media, especially in Japan.
If we do nothing, things are going to get worse and worse, and everything will gradually begin to break down. And we'll join the earlier civilizations that were not able to make the needed course corrections. I have, until recently, rejected the idea that food could be the weak link in our early 21st century civilization. But I'm now beginning to wonder if food shortages could bring down our civilization.
If you were to visit the markets of the world, it's hard to imagine that food shortages could bring down civilization. Today, more food is available to more people in more places than ever before.
But what will happen in the future when there's a growing demand for livestock and poultry products and on a scale the world has never experienced? There are 3 or 4 billion people in the world now whose incomes are rising, who want to move up the food chain, who want to consume a lot of livestock products, meat, milk, and eggs, as we do in the United States and the other industrial countries.
As middle-class populations grow in countries like India and China, and the appetite for meat and eggs and dairy products grows, it basically puts that much more stress on the land, because you have to produce the food not just for the people, but for the animals that produce those other kinds of foods. So it just, escalates the food problem.
As the world's economies continue to grow, food stalls will begin to offer more popular products like meat, milk, and eggs that will require massive amounts of grain for feed. It's beginning to happen in India, and we've already seen this become a reality in China, which now accounts for over a quarter of the world's consumption of meat.
The big issue on the planet is not just the fact that we're going from 6.7 billion people today to 9.2 billion, that the population in total is increasing. The big problem on the planet is actually the number of Americans who are increasing. That is, the number of people living an American lifestyle, eating American-sized Big Macs, living in American-sized houses, driving American-sized cars, on American-sized highways, in American-sized malls. In some ways, it's a wonderful thing that so many more people in China and India, Russia and Brazil can live an American lifestyle. There's just one problem with all these carbon copies of Americans. If we, the original Americans, don't redefine in more sustainable terms what it means to be an American, we're going to heat up, choke up, smoke up, and devour up this earth.
What we're talking about here is a train wreck where it's not clear how we can feed the world with a Western diet and also supply energy with Western demands, and at the same time curb carbon dioxide. Something has to give in that picture.
And now, in the last few years, we've seen the emergence of a third major claim on the world's grain supplies, and that is the conversion of grain into fuel for cars in the form of ethanol.
Hi! I want to talk to you today about something that's really important. Ethanol. Ethanol comes from corn. It's then added to gasoline to make it work better. It decreases
A series of commercials promoting the conversion of grain to ethanol failed to mention one key fact. It takes a lot of grain to fuel cars. For example, the grain required to fill a 25-gallon SUV tank with ethanol is enough to feed one person for a year.
This is crazy. All these cars are burning fossil fuel. But what if we went to America's heartland and we grew a renewable fuel? Ethanol, a fuel made from corn. So say 20% of these cars use ethanol, or 50%, 75%. Hey, call me crazy, but what if 100% of these cars are driving with ethanol?
But with the capacity to convert grain into fuel for cars, what we're beginning to see now is an emerging competition between the 800 million people in the world who own automobiles and who want to maintain their mobility, competing with the 3 billion poorest people in the world for the same grain. In recent years, 1/4 of the U.S. grain harvest has been diverted to the production of ethanol. However, America is the world's leading producer and exporter of grain. And when that grain is no longer available for feed or food, we have a global problem.
The demand for ethanol presented a problem, and that led to the world food crisis. It was one of the key factors that led into this food crisis we had in 2006, 2008, and that we're still feeling the impact of. The crisis we have today is driven by demand for food. Demand for food for consumption and demand for food for fuel or energy.
Somebody's got to produce that food. We have this religious belief that it will be produced, but we face a situation where world food stocks are at their lowest point in 45 years, where most arable land is under plow, where irrigation is stagnated. So where is it going to come from? I submit that you need something more than a religious belief that technology will save us to give me confidence that we can deal with this problem.
So we have three trends